Okay, so how many of you guys were here for my ArtSuite talk 2 months ago, something like that? I'm not going to go into too much on that. This is just the extension work, it's different stuff. But it's sort of extension work, and so we're going to start up over here with Artery. This is just a bunch of things I'm working on right now and things that are going through my head, so it's kind of an all over the place talk. So the ArtSuite stuff, just a quick recap, because Artery is an extension of that, is pure JavaScript framework for writing apps that uses Canvas and is inspired by Facebook's React and Flux stuff. So a rapid development, target all platforms, UI development platform. And we were running it against Parse, and Parse is going away. Hence the inspiration for Artery.
When you say all platforms, are you talking about all web platforms or including mobile?
Including mobile.
I see.
In fact, mobile was my primary target.
I see.
I was kind of shocked when I made the slides for the last presentation. Like ImyKimmy supports over a half dozen languages and over a half dozen platforms. And that's just me at the moment. It's ridiculous. So the idea is to bring it down to one. So on mobile, it's using Cordova as the base for packaging, and all it could be other things. But basically, it's a web browser that you don't see running the platform, and then hooks into the native code, so you can use all the native features.
I see.
But the nice thing is that you develop the UI and everything, and you can deploy it to the web as well, and it works great on mobile. In fact, it works better than most mobile websites. It's designed for mobile first. So that stuff is still coming along. It's still available online, and it's getting better every day. I'm pretty excited with where it's going. We now have live code on the web, the Kimmy customizer, and now we have a new Kimmy FrameMaker, so people can now make frames again without the plugin for the first time ever. And that's all using the new stuff. So if you go to the Kimmy website and customize something, that UI is all using the new Art Engine stuff. So Artery is the backend. And I liked working with Parse a lot, although there were some shortcomings. But what I really loved is that I basically didn't have to write server-side code. And the more I was in that world, the more I realized that server-side code is generally some order of magnitude more difficult to deal with than client-side code. Just the biggest reason is because you don't have the rich development environment. You got to deal with logs and other things on a remote server. And so I more and more came to this focus of, well, how can we write as little server-side code as possible? Obviously, some code is going to have to be server-side, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But I think you can actually develop the entire code client-side and then deploy it, which we'll talk about in a moment. So Jason and I talked a little bit about this, but there's really only two things that you really need to have server-side. And you guys have any immediate guesses of what needs to be server-side versus what can be client-side?
Identity.
What's that?
Identity.
Identity, so security. Yeah. And the other one is performance. If you're doing a lot of little requests over the web, particularly over mobile, it's going to be slow. So you want to do aggregate requests within a single request client side. Other than that, there's nothing else that needs to be server-side except for back-end data processing, which I think is a whole different category of your app anyway. It's not your front-end API, that's back-end stuff and so forth.
One question, are you assuming that you have in your model, do you have an API-first model where you have a public API and you're exposing that to customers, or is it just you want UI components to work on all platforms, but you don't necessarily need an API that others can consume?
This is not, I'm not initially planning, this could be an API, become an API that others could consume, but this basically, Artery will create an API as you go, basically. It'll create both the server and the client side to make it work. But then it effectively becomes a public API. So you could lock it down and you could publicize what the spec is and then go from there.
But is it a REST API or a JavaScript API?
It doesn't matter, actually. You can plug in your own plumbing between client-side and server-side as a module that sits in between. And once you've done that, then you don't have to think about it. It'll define the endpoints to make your connection go through. We'll talk about the structure here.
Okay.
You talk about the need for upgrades. That's one of the considerations of having stuff on the server side. You get to upgrade it, and it's upgraded rather than having to ask 100,000 people to please click this down.
Right. Actually, in this world, it's great, and potentially even better than apps, because Apple and other services allow you to do some amount of limited updating of code from the web if you're running JavaScript code. Basically, it's patches and minor improvements is what I've read Apple officially allows. I don't know what Google Play's policy is on that. And then if you're running on the web, I mean, it's going to come off the web if someone goes to the website, but it's basically going to download a JavaScript package, which you can update whenever you want with the current code. But in theory, yes, you can do minor updates that are within, I mean, in principle, you can do any update, but there's whatever Apple and Google Play decide they want to limit you to. Well, how do you avoid pissing off the titans out there? I just stopped a couple of advantages off the top of my head, but the main thing is if you're running everything client-side and you're running everything in the same language and with the same runtime, it's just a heck of a lot easier to, particularly for the rapid development phase. I think this would probably be good for long-term maintenance as well, but my focus is rapid development. And so it's about how can you get it logically working correctly as quickly as possible, and then have it be performant and secure when you deploy it. I believe that it'll probably be good for long-term maintenance, but I'm not focused as heavily on that. So the basic concept is that you're going to develop all client-side, and you'll be able to, via configuration, decide which parts you want to run server-side. And then when your deploy script just basically does the right thing. It sets up, configures it so some things run client-side, some things run server-side for production. But for development, and even just for deploying tests, you can deploy it with it all just being client-side. So the basic idea is comes from, it's not really a new idea, it's just taking an old idea, as most ideas are. So Parse had the ability to have before and after hooks for any database activity, basically. And that's pretty much all this is. So we have request pipelines. A pipeline is a set of before filters, and it does the request, and then a set of after filters on the tail end. And you do one of these pipelines per table, or per whatever logical unit you want, ultimately, but per table is generally the most convenient unit. And essentially, at the core, you get CRUD for free with this system, and you can easily add custom queries and custom mutations beyond that. Custom mutations are mostly going to be, these sort of aggregate requests. You want a request that's got a couple of things that's going to update or whatever else. You want to have that all happen server-side, so you just make a special request for that. In particular, if we're using DynamoDB, and DynamoDB has a handful of special atomic things it can do, but not everything it can do. And you really want to have your verification and validation phase happen before that code that's very hard to otherwise automatically check happens. So that ends up working out pretty well. You can do most of your stuff with CRUD, and then you put a couple custom queries in, and a couple custom mutations in, and it's the custom queries and custom mutations. You actually just write in something that is essentially the direct API to like DynamoDB. So you can just write it in whatever your backend ends up looking like, so it doesn't have to be too removed from that. DynamoDB's API is like all I do is APIs. It's heinous, and so I've written another little open source module that skins it and makes it a little easier, but it's basically the same thing. Would you guys like to see a little bit of diagramming about how these pipelines work, or just some examples of the filters that you can put onto it to make it work?
Sure.
Diagrams, filters.
Diagrams.
Diagrams, all right. Let's draw a couple diagrams. Got a pen and pen. So the basic idea is we have a request that comes in, we have some backend, and we have a response that goes back out. And logically, we're going to have, a request is a specific object, and a response is a specific object. And then you can basically attach filters to the process of it going towards the server and the process of it coming back from the server. And for convenience, the filter actually is structured like this. The object install can filter anything going in and anything going back out on that pipeline. But I'll show you an example in a moment of the actual code. Usually a filter will say, well, I care about the create record request. That's all I care about, and I only care about it on creation. One of the filters I'm going to show you is a UUID filter. With DynamoDB, you have to generate your own unique IDs. It's really not a lot of logic, but whenever with this, you just hook the create request and add another field, set a UID, and let it go on its way.
Can I just ask one question? So you're basically sending business logic from the client to the server to run before it runs the database transaction.
Right.
What is that? Does that language have to be encoded in JavaScript, or?
And with what I'm doing, yes. In principle, this could be applied in different ways, but my library is JavaScript.
Gotcha.
So it expects a Node backend, or in this case, we're going to use in Lambda, which is Node ultimately.
Okay.
But yes, it does assume that you have a backend that runs the same source as your front end in some way. So if you've got something else that compiles to JavaScript, that would be a great way to do it. Maybe it's compiles to JavaScript for the front end, but then runs that same code in the back end. That theory can happen, but this implementation is JavaScript. So the other, like a really important one, is obviously access and security. And so that plugin will typically work both before and after. You want to certainly writes. We'll put validation separate. Just validate that the write has the right fields, otherwise reject it. But then also authorization. You can check if you're authorized to do the write. And then in response, you might want to inspect the record to determine if you're allowed to read the record on response. And the plugin, the filter is easy to, you can write your own code for the filter, so you can really do the filter before or after, however you want to do it. But these filters are designed to be packageable and shareable, so people can write standard ways to do things. I'm kind of excited about that because Parse's ACL system is powerful, but it has certain limitations. And that it could do anything, but it gets convoluted to do certain things. And like, we want to be able to write private threads, and that you can, and then the logic of who can see your private thread was not totally trivial with the Parse system. But this lets me write a little bit of custom code for how we want to deal with that access, and it's pretty neat.
Are you using Parse's open source code, or are you just borrowing things that you like from it?
I'm borrowing mostly just the concept of before and after. Since the backend is not at all like Parse. So let's just do a couple more example filters on the list. So we got validation up there. Timestamps is another thing that Parse gave you for free, which is great. But that's just like the UID. It's just a couple fields that you set ahead of time. We're going to look at these two just a moment, just an example of them. Authorization we talked about. Counter is another great example. So after you've written a record, you might want to update some counts somewhere, and so you just put a before and after filter on it. Change push notifications is a big thing that we're doing, which is just anytime a record is altered, it sends out a push notification to all clients that are currently online so they can need to see updates. And what's good with that is just a handful of lines of code, and you just put it on all of your tables, and great, you're done. Includes is another thing that Parse did that was pretty handy, which is you request a single record, and you can pull in some of the linked other records server side, and it all comes down as a single bundle. And that's really a performance thing. And really, most of your database logic can be packaged in this way fairly well. You can test it all client side, so you can test to make sure your logic works with, tests. There's the client side DynamoDB, which I'm using, which works great. And so you can just fire it up, run your tests, make sure it all works reasonably well. I don't have actually the pushing your code server side stuff working yet. I've got most everything else working. But once that's there too, you'll be able to flip a switch and say, okay, deploy this to your test environment and then run your tests against it, just to make sure that there's not something weird pushing it to the server. So that is Artery. So that's what I've got so much on that. Any questions about that?
How would you characterize the sweet spot of Artery? Like, is it primarily for building transactional web apps that are kind of?
It's certainly the same sweet spot that Parse is going after, which is that you've got a client-heavy app and you want some data backend.
Right.
And you might have reasonably sophisticated needs for that backend, but you're really focused on delivering this high-quality client experience, and you want to be able to share data across the clients. That's certainly a sweet spot. I think that a lot of things fit in that, and then the main thing this doesn't cover at all, again, is that you might want to have extensive backend data processing, analyzing your data and massaging it and pulling out information. I'm going to use this to probably wrap around the Elasticsearch on AWS too. If it's something that just basically is kind of CRUD-like, it wraps pretty nicely around it no matter what the backend looks like. But really, you're going to get the most advantage of if you can reuse the filters across your various things. So all of our Dynamo needs to need UUID. Correct. Let's actually, real quick, let's go ahead and just take a look at a little bit of code, since I have some code up here. So big.
Is dot copy a DSL?
What's that?
The dot copy extension?
This is CopyScript.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So precompiler for JavaScript.
Gotcha.
So this is all boilerplate here, but what's really interesting here is this. So we're extending the filter class, and you can just declare before the create action. And this is it. This is all that UUID is. Just take the request, create before request, take a request and return another request, or they return a response. If they return a response, we're done. It just sends the response back. If you return another request, it continues down the pipeline. So it just says return the request with merging in the ID field and generating new UUID. And so it's really that simple to do these create field ones. And the next one is more or less the same. This is the timestamp filter. So for when it is created, we set both of the fields to the current date. And when it's updated, we just update the updated at. And that's just how much it takes to be able to implement one of these bits of logic. And most of them are about that short. This little bit down here is kind of handy. It lets me declare what the field types are, so that I also have auto-vivification of the backend table for development. So you create your class with your table, and you just start using it. And this will automatically vivify the table into existence. And eventually, I will probably have it also generate migration scripts for your production system.
Related to this,
Mhm.
since the filters are isomorphic and can run on both client
Right.
server eventually, if I were to use something like Flow or something, would that effectively give me type safe APIs?
I think that hypothetically, yes, that could work. I don't know the details of
I
Flow,
assume
but
that these would be at runtime, you know.
right, this is all runtime stuff, and you can install your own custom code. All it really cares about is that you take a request in, and you return a request.
Right.
And then beyond that, you can set it up however you want. And then basically the API will get defined by which things are going to run server-side, which things are going to run client-side. Basically, there's the first server-side thing in the channel needs to be run server-side. They're going to cut the link right there and put a remote call in. And that remote call is going to be defined by, actually, the remote call is straightforward. It's going to be sending the request across, which is going to be the request type and the payload. So the API is pretty much defined just by the action that's going across. But then what's expected to be on server-side or client-side is based on your configuration. And yeah, you could certainly have type check stuff going. I mean, this is your own custom code, so you can put your own type checking in there if you want to.
Or you're open sourcing this and
Oh, yeah.
Evangelize this for other people to use
Yep.
if they want to.
Totally. And other than using the same foundation libraries, Artery is its own standalone thing. It doesn't need to have use the rest of our stuff.
And since you're working with Lambda and Dynamo, etc. on this stuff, I mean, is there a AWS sort of ecosystem way to submit this or to promote it to the AWS community? Or
I don't know that yet. But yeah, it's certainly appropriate. This is everything you've seen here is agnostic about what the back end is. It's just I will be making a plugin for Dynamo and Lambda because that's what we're going to be using. But in principle, it should be pretty easy to make it fairly agnostic. And I think I've got this last one here. So this last one shows in your app itself. This is actually from my demo from 2 months ago, the Art Suite, where I had the little chat app. This is just replacing the model for the chat app. And this could be even streamlined even further, but basically it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to declare my pipeline. This is a new model type, which just takes any pipeline. So you just declare it, then add a pipeline to it, and it's ready to go. And so the pipeline is a DynamoDB pipeline specifically. And then I attach some filters to it. And the last one is the validation filter. And I have some predefined validators for these fields. And that's it. That right there is already pretty much a fully functional thing. This is not the final class for this because I have a query to start with. So I have to declare my query, which is another couple lines here and then the actual DynamoDB line of code to implement the query. One of the nice things about the queries are going to be a little bit separate from other custom code in that the return records will get run through the return pipeline for GET. So any of your validation, any of your authorization code will run on return records coming back from any query. So you just write it once to validate, to say when that record is going to be returned, upon inspection of that and your session, and all queries will automatically be secure in that way. So just this is an example of this is actually just a method. It doesn't matter what the method is that I would call in the model. And the model, this section just invokes the create action, obviously just create the record, and then it would go down the pipeline, get its UUID, get its timestamp, get validated based on these 3 fields. These guys declared fields too, if you remember, and that automatically, I don't think it does, but it should automatically add to the validation filter as well. The validation filter would also be able to have access to that data and validate those fields as well.
So your UID filter is aware of the validation filter somehow then?
All of these guys know that they're attached to a pipeline. UID filter would not be. But all of these filters have a standard way of just declaring fields. So the validation filter can go, pipeline, give me a list of all the fields people are going to create. And that's what I'm going to validate.
Can you give an example of how you would enforce a security restriction on one user writing to another user's message?
Right. So the one thing I haven't talked about and I haven't actually implemented yet, but it's pretty straightforward, is there'll also be a simple session system using standard encoded cookie sessions, basically, which so basically you can just validate. So assume we have validated the user, and now we have a validated session token. So the probably be a filter, although it might be something else. But probably be a filter right at the beginning of your line would be, all right, let's validate the session. And then when you get down here to, we'd have a authorization filter probably. And it might just be custom to the specific model, for example. The authorization filter could just implement in a before filter, before get, maybe it's just a fetch. So before get, you have the request coming in. The request also gives you access to the session, which will be validated at that point. And so you would compare the session, say only owners can read it. You would do that on an after filter because you don't know if they're an owner yet. So you do the after filter, you fetch the record out of the database, you look at the session, you look at the user ID, see if they're the owner. If they are not, you return a error request rather than a valid response.
Well, how do you restrict a collection? That's probably the more interesting case where you say, give me all the threads that I can see.
Right.
You wouldn't want to get all of the threads and then after retrieving them from the database, filter them to the ones that I can't see.
Well, that's essentially what happens, but it would be done with one request. So the query would run server side, and then the data would come back to the query, to the pipeline in Lambda, and then it could filter on a per record basis before it goes back out the door.
But you don't want a query that retrieves everything
the entire
from the
database.
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
so you,
Well, all that you see would have to have a query restriction, right? So you want to start with just, there's the authorization and then just give them the right results. So in that case, you would be,
it's really interesting though that you separated those concerns. And I actually think that's a really important feature.
Right.
Is that you can,
So you would need to
instead of
design-
conflating those two questions, you can isolate the security rules in one single location where you have your authorization filter,
Right.
whatever security business logic that you need. And in addition to that, you're also not selecting stuff that you don't want.
So in that case, that would be a database design question, right? So you would need a way to be able to query the database for a specific subset quickly. And you'd have to just basically use DynamoDB's got a certain amount of indexing capabilities and so forth. You have to design that in your database level so you can have an efficient query coming back. But it might be a slight superset, like maybe some of the things you don't have authorization to, even though most of them are the right ones. And that's when the authorization filter would kick a few more of them out.
And the kind of app I'm thinking about, it's the case where most things I don't have access to.
Right.
So if I have 100 million threads that are happening in the application and I can see 6,
Right.
you know,
Well, I mean, the simplest version is you'd have a many-to-many table, which literally has that mapping.
sure,
Right.
sure. The thing that I'm thinking about is in old school ORMs and Hibernate and Java, which is the stuff that I dealt with.
Right.
You have the ability to define always, whether people ask or not, add this limitation on it. So if the table has a key for the user ID, which you get from the magic, it's kind of magic and weird,
Right.
but it was super convenient so that you could say, always add the constraint that the user ID field on the table matches current logged in user. So
Right.
anywhere the queries only ever, if you've got that restriction on the database, can you do that with the
This could
request
not.
pipeline?
The simple version is no, but you can add your own little custom code for the query is yes. So what you would do is that's between you and the actual database backend, because the database backend would have to serve that up. It would have to be able to know how to do that efficiently. So some combination of how you create the table and how you query the table has to have that support. And if your database backend has it in a one-line declaration, then that could totally just be when you create the table, you declare that, like you described. And that would now be a constraint that the backend database is now going to enforce. And then when you do the query request, one of the parameters is user ID, and then it enforces that constraint.
But you wouldn't set it up as you go to the previous piece of code where you're setting up the
filter?
here's the next one. Yeah, where's the one where you actually set the pipeline?
Yeah.
Where you've got some sort of request filter that's like restricts to logged in user filter.
Right.
That would work together with any kind of thing that you're requesting. Would that?
I think that actually could totally work. So you can have a pre-fill. So like really, again, the backend needs to know how to support it because it needs to know how to do indexing and query efficiently. But you can have a before filter which just explicitly took the current user ID of the session and then added it to the request like this with a merge data line that says only authorized for this user. And then the backend picks that up and says, okay, I will do the right thing with that. And so yeah, you can define one filter that did exactly that, and then the backend will know what to do with it and return the results. I think that is Barbary.
Is it the security model strikes me as being similar to your environments concept in VREF, right? So you're applying a set of security rules on the transit of information from one place to another as kind of a gatekeeper or filter.
Right, as a filter, and you apply it on a per table basis is the basic, but it could be whatever backend logic structure you want. But then you share it across all of your things with just a simple filter. So you write the filter once, and you can put it across multiple tables if you want to. Yeah. And this set is like going to be so common that I might just make a hybrid filter that just declares all of them as a set. Like, you always want your UID, you always want your timestamp, etc. Cool. So that's coming along. And
I just one question. I'm not a UI expert, but I just wanted to understand another kind of security concern is. I know JavaScript allows you to do, a lot of things that do with like renaming functions or replacing. My question is, could somebody study the business logic that's exposed in the front end and then sort of inject something where they essentially override any sort of back end security protections and say
if they can eval any code that's user data, yeah.
Well, the answer is they can't, specifically because when you deploy it to production, you use your special keys to deploy to production. Yeah. And so the backend is locked down when you deploy it to production. So the backend does not run custom code that comes from the client at all. So
I thought we're sending business logic from the browser to the backend and telling it to run this JavaScript.
We do, but we do it as a deploy step. That isn't coming from the client.
I see.
So when you deploy it, it's going to package up just your models, send them up to the server, and lock that down so that it's secure.
Because when you're developing, you're running the code on the client side only with client-side Dynamo.
Right.
And then you decide to ship, and when you do that, you deploy to the server.
You deploy it to the server, and then you lock it down. So the server just has a REST API or whatever glue you want between client and server.
I see.
And to the end users, all it is it's going to be a request type and then a payload. And the payload is data. And there's not anything client side that gets pushed to run server side. But that does bring up the interesting thing that by default, all of your business logic is going to be exposed client side.
Yeah.
That's basically a security by obscurity question. Right? You should be secure regardless of your obscurity. So it should be okay for you to source business logic. But it would not be too hard to configure the system so that it could actually remove the things that are supposed to run server side entirely from the deployed code. That would require a little bit of source mangling, but that can certainly happen for people who are concerned about that. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about some of your filters defining like a field, and you said that would auto-vivify.
Right, auto-create.
Auto-create.
Yeah, vivify means creative doesn't exist. Bring to life.
Yeah,
vivify.
Can you talk about, I've never used DynamoDB. Is that, what kind of solution is that, and how does that auto-create?
DynamoDB doesn't have auto-create itself. So this system, when you're running in development mode, the first request you make on a table, it checks to see if it exists. If it doesn't, it automatically creates it, given whatever creation parameters you give. I'm not showing it here, but actually you can put options right here, and some of those options are, here's additional things I want to add to the creation. One of the things you might want to add is additional indexes, for example. DynamoDB is primary reason I'm selecting is one is it scales infinitely and it's high performant. And it's basically the only option of Amazon's web services that works like that. Okay. It does have indexing, somewhat limited indexing, but basically enough for what most people need. It
Is
is
it built in, or do you have to create it
It's
yourself?
built in. So its primary thing is it's a hash-based database. So it takes your key, hashes it, and knows which table to go fetch your data. And so the indexing works similarly in that an index has a hash key and a range key. And so it hashes it to a specific database, a specific server, and that has to just be a direct hash. You can't just say, give me the biggest value across all databases. But once you got to that server, they've got fairly decent keys about whatever you want. So within that server, you can say, okay, well, like go to all of Adam's records. Well, those hash to a specific table. And then I can say, query, do some sort on those specific records. So you can't do global queries, but you can narrow it down to a specific server and then do queries within that server. 99% of the time, particularly if you're doing anything that's serving a bunch of users, which is what our structure is. I think the limitation is, what is the limitation? It's like 5 terabytes or something per chunk. So you have to have all your records that hash to the same key be less than 5 terabytes of data, but that's not an unreasonable limitation. And yeah, then they have what they call global indexes, and so even though like all these records are on one server, you can re-index it, which basically effectively makes a whole new table, by a different hash key. So those records can then be distributed across all the other databases in a different index. So it's a fairly powerful system.
So we helped a client implement, parse as a replacement for Facebook's parse. It's shutting down, and in doing so, we heard that a lot of the bigger tech companies were either going to do that, like we heard that Azure was going to do it, we heard that Amazon was going to do something along those lines, but just wondering if there may be an opportunity for you to go like pitch this back-end service platform to somebody who might want to pick it up and make it part of their offering.
Yeah, I don't know.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see. I mean, that's not our use case. I haven't thought about that, but I think it's going to be very agile. That's really my goal here, and I think it'll be fairly maintainable. That's the bigger question, but I think it will be.
But Jason, you didn't quite follow. What are they going to do?
So Facebook is shutting down Parse.
I know,
Parse
Stuart,
is
I have to
a
go.
service a lot of people use.
Yeah.
So we helped the client
Thanks for
implement their own
Thanks, this
version
was
of
really
Parse
interesting.
using
Sorry,
open
let's
source,
go.
so that they can take
Yeah, thanks for
migration
talking.
Yeah.
onto their platform. For people anyway.
I see.
That's going to be shut down like February. So.
Okay.
All right, so we got like 20 minutes
Sorry,
and 2 more topics, so we're going to
Yeah,
just
go
kind of
ahead.
skim over them. These ones are more experimental, but also fun. So I'm using CoffeeScript, and CoffeeScript is basically not being maintained, which is sad because I love CoffeeScript, but it really needs an update, and so my brain is, I don't need another project, I really don't, but my brain just can't stop. So I've got like, I don't know, a couple hundred notes in Evernote that every time I'm like, oh,
This
CoffeeScript
is like
shows.
Shane R&D going on.
Yeah, this is Shane R&D, and this stuff is this is a side project to my side project, so it's just kind of cranking along. And it doesn't require for us to deploy what we're deploying, so I'm trying very hard to make it not block the critical path. Artery is required to deploy. Caffeine MC, Metacompiler and Caffeine Script are not. So I just started, I got a whole bunch of ideas for what Caffeine Script might look like, which I got the domain thanks to your suggestion, Jason, so caffeinescript.com. And just this idea popped in my head for this metacompiler, which kind of blew my mind a little bit, and as I discovered the implications of it. So, I mean, what even is a metacompiler? I just made it up, actually. But what this thing does specifically is you can write your own custom metacode. It's interesting, it doesn't show you my pluses. It's kind of fun. Either at the beginning of a file or as a config file for your entire project, or given those two controls really anywhere you want, that configures how your compiler works. So on a per file basis, from inside the file, you can configure how your compiler works. And that allows you to configure it, extend it, select it, or even choose a different compiler. And that seems academic and kind of interesting, so why do we care? Well, the big one is this one. Languages evolve slowly, because if they add something, it breaks code, or it might break code. But if you can just add it on a per-file basis, you can add anything that won't break anyone's code, because they just opt in. It's kind of like Firefox. You can add another plugin in if you want for your stuff. Which gives us the ability to really experiment with new programming extensions, at a much more rapid pace. And some people will be like, oh my god, that's scary. Well, you just use the more standard ones if you want. You don't have to use the most cutting edge stuff, just like Firefox. And you might, those of you guys who remember me talking about my DRF stuff a long time ago, fundamentally I consider source code to be a view to the logic of your program. And this is more along those lines of, this just allows you to configure your view. You aren't locked into one single view for your source code. This is also one of my other philosophies, which is that we're going to maximize our programming power, we need to push everything into the runtime. So that includes our programming environment, our debug environment, our editor, our compiler. If everything's running the same code in the same runtime, it opens up crazy new possibilities like this. And it turns out that there's enough enabling tech to make this fairly easy. This is done, by the way. Caffeine MC is done. It basically works. It was like 100 lines of code. And it's kind of cool. I have it currently compiling with CoffeeScript or JavaScript, and you can add your own compiler trivially. And that's what CaffeineScript will be. CaffeineScript is not done. So Webpack.
What's the difference between those two?
Caffeine Metacompiler, I'm using the same word twice, but the Metacompiler just is, it's basically like a preprocessor for your file. It takes a certain escaped bit of code at the beginning of your file, which can be arbitrary code, which will configure your compiling environment, strip that off the file, and then run whatever you just configured it on the rest of the file.
I see.
That's it. That's all it does.
I see.
But it opens up this ability of being able to pull in modules to extend your library, your code, with this special additional thing we'll talk about in a moment. So Webpack is standard JavaScript packager. It works great. We have a platform now for packaging that's easy and powerful. This already exists, but you need a compiler that has dynamic module loading so it can load dynamic code as the compiler is running. And ideally it's written in the same language as the code you're generating, just because again, it makes your code reusable in a better way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. But that's just Node, right? We have that with Node. And in principle, it can even work with Java, because Java has dynamic module loading. It'd be probably a little more awkward without dynamic typing, but I think it would still work. And since I'm a CoffeeScript junkie, I pretty much consider JavaScript to be a machine language at this point. I would not write JavaScript because it's heinous. But we have a common target platform. And so we know we can generate. The nice thing is JavaScript is moderately human readable, and so you can see what the code generates, and at least you understand what it generated. Which is one of the things I do with CoffeeScript. CoffeeScript is a little rough, and unfortunately it's not being updated. But if you don't understand what it's doing, you just look at what it generates, and then you can move from there. So yeah, Caffeine MC is not actually on NPM yet, but it is on GitHub and it's public, and it basically already does this. I don't actually have it writing the files out, but that's trivial addition. It's almost done. I don't actually think I'm even talking about this other than this bullet point, but it's a very important little bullet point, which is that parsers are not designed to be extensible at runtime. And if you do LR out of one, I always forget the acronym, but like the standard parsers, you write in a special language, you literally compile a parser into your code, and then you deploy the code. And so there's really no way to extend a parser at runtime. But the new brand of parsers, which are getting more and more popular, which is the parsing expression grammar parsers, can be extended at runtime in principle. They are essentially recursive regular expression parsers. So it's basically regular expressions, except for it knows about matching parentheses and so forth, effectively. But it doesn't have to be precompiled, and you can add more rules at runtime to extend the language. Turns out there are several parsing expression grammar languages, NPMs, out there, but just like there was on Ruby, they all are this old way of thinking. They take some special source code, which is their own special format, compiles it into JavaScript, and then you run your JavaScript. So again, they aren't designed to be extensible at runtime. So I ported my Ruby Babel bridge to JavaScript, and that is also up and working. So you can write parsers I remember a long time ago where I wrote a Turing-complete programming language in 40 minutes. That was on Babel Bridge, and now it's available on JavaScript. And so that, I don't have a demo today of how you can extend it, but it actually is working as an extensible thing. When you inherit from a parent class, when you inherit from a parent class, it gets a clone of all its rules, and then you can add your own rules. And so CoffeeScript, the metacompiler will run, and will just inherit from the standard language, and then you can just add your own rules on top of it to add your own special parsing. And then you also need extensible code generation, the ability to generate out code, and that's what the language specifically is going to need to define how that works. And I don't quite know how that's going to work yet. I don't think it'll be hard, but I don't design that yet. So I think we're pretty sure we can all these. You can experiment a lot more. You can customize. You can completely replace your language. This is curiously close to Lisp macros, which is kind of cool. And I want to definitely say macros are awesome because I don't. But this is a little bit higher, more powerful than macros in that macros can't alter the parser. Macros, the Lisp parser is so super simple that it really looks almost like you're altering the parser. I don't have an example. I did some research on this, but you can't actually alter the parser. But what you can do, Lisp macros let you modify the parse tree before code generation happens, is basically what they do. So they let you write Lisp code to modify Lisp code before it generates the actual runtime code. So they're pretty damn powerful. In fact, the effective power is somewhat similar, but my goal was to be able to actually also extend the parsing, because I want to be able to work on streamlining languages. I think they can be a lot more streamlined than they are. And it's just a language feature ultimately, so you obviously implement it by extending a language. And this is just a couple of things I've been thinking about, but the fact that you can make an NPM module that anyone can share, and you can either just hook it in once for your entire project or once on a per file basis. You can implement macros. Often you might have a chunk of data that you want to compile into your program, and well, you just fit it into what your programming language structure is, but that might not be the most convenient way to format your data. Well, you just put a little custom parser in front of it, and it will output JavaScript, and you're good to go. And then the main thing I want for is I just want to be able to take CoffeeScript and fix it without having to rewrite the whole damn thing, which is what I'm going to end up doing. So that is, let's go.
We get to see some caffeine script.
I have some caffeine script. Not that's like sketches, it's not real, but I just wanted to show this. I'm still playing around with how we do the escape code in your file. Oh my god, that's ginormous. But so there'll be some escape code in your file that says, okay, we're going to do the metacompiler. And then my plan right here is it's just indented. So you say this, and then everything that's indented is just code that gets executed. And then the first undented line, that's the rest of the file. Anyway, so you can set your compiler wherever you want. There are going to be some string-defined ones, which is default. JavaScript is basically a no-op. It just copies it in and spits it back out. But literally, you do that much, and now this rest of the file is JavaScript. This one is a completely custom parser right here in line. This parser just takes all the words with any number of spaces between them and puts commas between them and outputs them as commas as a JavaScript string, because it's generating JavaScript. This is actually an example of using Babel Bridge. But it just parses words and spaces, and it has these functions that says to JavaScript, and it puts all the words together and joins them with a comma. So, terribly simple parser, but all of a sudden now the rest of the file can just be text, and it will do that thing with it.
Is your compact flatten being used?
I don't know if compact.
You should get rid of it.
Oh, yeah, you might do that. Well, that actually brings up one of the features of CaffeineScript.
Okay.
Because I have that problem all the time. I pull in something, I use it for a little bit, and I forget to unpull it in.
Yeah.
So, good. CaffeineScript's the shortest talk here because it doesn't really exist yet. So immediately, CoffeeScript it really should have a 1.1, which is basically some of these things. Some of its code generation is crappy. The output code that it outputs is either long or inefficient. So I want to also generate more performant code. If you use the dots, the splats for collecting your arguments, just the way he implemented it's slow. That's why I generally don't use it. I just do my own. I say arguments, which is in JavaScript how you get all the arguments, and then you do your own thing with them. And increased language consistency. I think this is a failure of his parser, but there's a lot of things that are completely logically consistent with the language that create syntax errors, which is just a shortcoming of the parser, I think. Since I'm using parsing expression grammars instead of LRR1 parsers, I'm going to be in a totally different world. I think I can make that much more consistent. Slightly different top-level design goals. He did not want to use a runtime, and I think that was probably appropriate when CoffeeScript came out 5 years ago, but like when you declare a class, it puts like 3 lines of code of JavaScript in that file. I got maybe 500 or 1,000 classes in my source code now, and each one has this class generating code in it. So a tiny little runtime that has this code across all files will actually reduce my overall file size quite a bit. My intention is to make that runtime really lean, just the bare minimum to support things, because otherwise you can pull in your own runtime for other things. But enough to actually streamline things and make these more efficient. This is actually not even highly important. And then you guys have probably heard me say this before, those of you who heard my talks, is I'm all about minimizing the tokens in my code as long as it maximizes readability. So that's my goal with the language. I'll come back to the new stuff, but just my plan is to implement an almost compatible CoffeeScript and then have modules for extending it from there. I'm going to go ahead and break consistency of the language because I have to go way out of my way to make it work badly. So I'm going to break consistency with CoffeeScript, but I'm trying to get as close as possible and then have modules for extending it with more stuff. So some obvious things is that CoffeeScript always targeted the lowest common denominator for its code generation. It doesn't even support some ES5 stuff, let alone ES6 stuff. Love to see what works best there, but certainly we should be able to keep up with ES6 feature set, and you'd be able to say in your compiler target ES6 and it can generate ES6. Expanded use of blocks, which I'll do some demos of. I love the indentation format. I didn't know I was going to love it until I really got into it, but now I go back to other languages, and I'm like, the end point is obvious. We all indent our code. That's a lot of redundancy. And I actually accept demos of these, but I realize I waste a ton of time, even still, being a pretty damn good programmer these days, making sure my brackets match. And that's just a waste of time, so let's eliminate that almost across the board. I think we can eliminate all except for the occasional parentheses for precedence. I think that you don't need any other block matching. And a couple other things. Let's just go. I have text demos of these. Let's just look at the text demos real quick, and then we will be essentially done. Caffeine script. All right, so the first one is if you want to invoke a method and have each of the args on separate lines, that's how you have to do it in CoffeeScript, which is just butt ugly. And if you're doing React-style development, my code has tons of method levels of indentations, which basically build up the structure of a tree. And just that little change will make my code much nicer, and anyone who's doing that sort of pattern. I understand why he did it that way. The way how he's parsing makes it very hard to do it this way consistently. And there are a couple interesting tripping points that I think I figured out how to solve from the parser perspective. But from the human perspective, it's really obvious when it should happen.
Just my own hang-up would be just knowing that the symbol on the top line of CaffeineScript is going to be a function call instead of something else. But I guess if you just have a dangling...
If you have a dangling value, it becomes a function call with a block indented after it.
So that's what I would have to put in my brain.
Right, you'd have to put that in your brain and see that. But and your syntax highlighter would highlight it for you and whatever else, and I think it's clear. If this is an object with a field colon value, CoffeeScript already does this. If I just had field colon, field colon, field colon, I wouldn't need that.
What if you have an expression and you want to call it, and the result of that expression is a function, and you want to call that function?
Right.
How's that? You don't have semicolons either. So how's that differentiated from just having an expression and having the next line that was indented for some mistake? I guess the indentation is something you're looking for as well, right?
The indentation is the signal. But then the main question that's challenging is how it interacts with other indentations, like an if block indentation.
Or like the declaration of a function.
Right.
That's
the declaration of a
right?
function has a dash arrow.
Okay.
But
So
this is optional. So if you wanted to make it clear in a more complex case, you could add the parentheses and the commas, right?
Right, the parentheses, I'd probably have the commas be optional as well. But yes, the parentheses definitely have to support parentheses for precedence anyway, and so those will be an open option. This is just a little one, but in CoffeeScript, equal greater than this value in JavaScript is really confusing. And in CoffeeScript, they have two different arrows, and one of them says, don't bind to this, and this one says, bind this to the outside context. But the thing is that when you're inside a method for a class, you really want everything to be bound to your current instance.
Yeah, it's weird.
I'm always tripping up over that even now after writing more CoffeeScript than most people have. And it's just a simple little changing of the logic. My intention is to have dash arrow be automatic, so if you're within a method, it will always bind this. But in other cases, it will not. And I think I'll probably use the Spermie operator, which is twiddle greater than for explicitly always bind in this situation. But I think that pretty much 99% of the time, you can do the right thing, and it's not complicated logic. It literally is, if you're inside a method, bind it, then bind this. Otherwise, don't bind this. So this is an example of me eliminating matching. So you do just a single symbol which says I want to declare an array. If you just leave it like that, it's just going to be an empty array. But if you indent it and put a list of things, great. That's going to fill up the whole array. In CoffeeScript, you have to do this. Similarly, you can do one-liners in that way. You just do your open close bracket, and it doesn't matter what the other bracket is. You just make your common list of things. I would probably still, at least for the one-liner, support both options, but I think that I'll find over time that that's an even easier option. Similarly, here's how you could do a list. Right now, CoffeeScript's fairly awkward if you want to do a list of objects. If you want to do just one object, if I just remove these two things, that's just one object, great. But if you need to have separate objects, it doesn't know how to stop one object and start the next object, so you got to put brackets around all of them. But here it basically becomes kind of like a bullet list, which makes it just
really cool.
neater. And here's where it gets even more interesting. I think this is going to be useful, but I can do indentation for strings as well. So just based on the indentation, this is all CoffeeScript, here's CaffeineScript. You don't have to put the closing quotes. You just say, I'm starting a quote thing, and the logic is that we'll remove the indentation from the string, but otherwise keep the rest. And in CoffeeScript, I probably will use its logic, which is that triple quote will maintain the new lines will persist through the else string, and double quote will remove white space. I'll do the same logic that they do. I forget exactly what they do. But their this multi-line thing will not have new lines, and this one will have new lines in CoffeeScript.
So in your tool chain, you have whatever editor you're going to edit that.
Mm-hmm.
That's syntax aware.
Right.
So do you have some way to bind your extensions to that so it adapts
The syntax
highlighting?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing. I don't know yet.
Yeah.
That would be an example where you want the editor to be running the same language as your development stuff.
Right.
And I'm running Sublime Text, which is, I think, Python underneath, so that doesn't quite work. But maybe Atom would be the place to do that.
So those previous examples are essentially annotations on a block that change how the literals inside the block
Are interpreted.
are interpreted.
Yeah, totally. So this is, you mentioned me removing my unneeded include. And so that's what this with statement is designed to do. With, you list a bunch of things which are objects, and any unbound reference inside that with block will search for it within the with list.
You can get that in JavaScript. That might just work.
In ES6?
No, just old JavaScript. It's like discouraged. The with keys.
I think there's a with keyword, but I don't think it does this. I have to go check. But
Interesting.
I'll have to take a look. But this is what most of my files look like. Like all of them have this kind of junk. And it simplifies down to this, or even if you just have one file which has a version of one big object, it simplifies it down to that. So it's a huge code savings. And also a lot of extra stuff, because I always forget to remove stuff that I'm no longer using.
So I do have to ask if the domain name you bought was EI or IE, because we've seen both of them. EI is correct.
It is EI.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I got the correct spelling. But we're all going to learn how to spell
How's that?
consistently, particularly me.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Well, it's I before E except after C,
except for caffeine.
except for caffeine. Wait, I before E except after C. No, it's after E, so E before I. It follows. It's not except, yeah.
So, yeah, anyway, this is another consistency thing. If you start a line with dot, CoffeeScript does somewhat inconsistent things. So I won't go into details on all that. But like, this is not a legal thing. That's a consistency issue. If you put a dot after an if-then, it just pukes. It doesn't like that. But it should just apply that to whatever the return result of the previous if statement is. And not that you have to understand all this, but this is what you have to do to do this stupid logic here, and this is do this, or that, or that. And then whatever the result is, do then on it. And that, I think, just reads really nicely and clearly, and this is, you have to parse on the parentheses and see what the priorities are, et cetera, et cetera.
Cool.
Yeah, there's more stuff, but we're over time, so we'll...
Thanks, Shane.
Yeah.
It's been a cool tour of your head.
Yeah. I can't believe you've done all this and have a toddler at the same time. I can't even use the computer. I can even type a password.
Yeah, we get a lot of great ideas.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
You should present this at a job.